Welcome to the Dream Novel channel. Before starting to listen to the fun in this clip, don't forget to like and comment, so that the admin will have the encouragement to continue making clips. Let's go listen. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 206, How is Quirrell still alive? We just went to talk to Hagrid for a bit, and you already know who Nicholas Flamel is? Ron asked, stunned, as he and Harry sat in the Gryffindor common room. Neither of them had expected Hermione to spring such a revelation on them as soon as they got back. Where on earth did you find that out? Harry asked, wide-eyed. On Dumbledore's chocolate frog card. Hermione replied impatiently. You two go on about how many cards you've collected, and yet neither of you noticed this. Hearing this, Harry's eyes widened in realization. No wonder he'd felt like he'd seen the name before. Now he remembered, he'd seen it on the train. Dumbledore was the first card he'd ever collected. Also, I found this, Hermione continued, pulling out a thick, worn book and flipping through its pages in front of them. Nicholas Flamel, the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone. What stone? Harry and Ron asked at once. Oh, come on, don't you two ever read? Just look for yourselves. Hermione shoved the book toward them and continued, I bet that big dog is guarding the Philosopher's Stone. Harry and Ron felt like two novices being guided through a dungeon by an expert player. They had just managed to read through the information she provided when they looked up and realized Hermione had practically solved the whole mystery already. Not only had she found Nicholas Flamel, but she'd even guessed what was hidden under the trapdoor. The Philosopher's Stone, no wonder Snape was after it. A stone that could create gold and grant immortality was something anyone would covet. And what about you two? Hermione said, closing the book. Did Hagrid tell you anything about what happened yesterday? No, Ron replied, sounding frustrated. Hagrid wouldn't say a thing. No matter what we asked, he wouldn't give anything away. But we did find out that Hagrid seemed to be hurt, Harry added, thinking back. There was a bottle of essence of dittany in his room. I remember it from herbology class, it's supposed to be good for treating wounds. Essence of dittany? Hermione frowned, her suspicions deepening. So Hagrid's reason for going to the hospital wing wasn't to help Madame Pomfrey, he must have gone because he was injured. She'd been right all along, Hagrid was definitely connected to what had happened yesterday. Maybe we could ask Kyle again, Ron suggested. No use, Hermione shook her head. If he wanted to tell us, he would have already. Besides, do you really think he'll slip up like Hagrid might? Hermione's right, Harry agreed. He wasn't eager to go talk to Kyle either, especially with everything going on in Quidditch. Since Ravenclaw's shocking win over Slytherin, Slytherin had no chance of winning the championship anymore. And since Ravenclaw had been shut out in their first match, their overall score wouldn't be enough to win, even after this victory. This meant that the upcoming game between Hufflepuff and Gryffindor was crucial, whoever won would clinch the championship early. Tensions between the two houses had plummeted to an icy low, and Harris and Wood had nearly come to blows in the corridor. With things this tense, even if they went to Kyle, he might not even want to talk to them. Harry had no desire to make matters worse. Seeing that Harry and Hermione were against the idea, Ron gave up on it too. When they went to class the next day, everyone was surprised to see Professor Quirrell again. Contrary to the many rumors circulating, he hadn't fallen prey to the supposed curse of the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor that seemed to strike every year. For many students, this was a huge letdown. They had been hoping that if Quirrell were out, the end-of-term exam might be cancelled. Still, some keen-eyed students noticed that Professor Quirrell's arm was bandaged heavily, including his wrist, and his face looked paler than usual. He explained to the class that he had taken a tumble down the stairs 2 days prior while rushing somewhere. This prompted another round of sighs from the students. Kyle overheard a nearby Slytherin mutter, with the mood this dark, all he managed was a broken arm. Whether because of his injury or another reason, Professor Quirrell didn't bring his teaching assistant this time. Instead, he led the class in a simple reading lesson. Anyone who didn't know better might have mistaken the class for history of magic. But even Professor Binns at least read the passages himself. Quirrell, on the other hand, had the students read aloud while he sat at the podium, appearing to doze off. The students were clearly unimpressed. Who couldn't read? Earning a salary for this was almost scandalous. If there were a Worst Professor award at Hogwarts, Quirrell would be the clear champion. Even a Krupp as a substitute teacher would have done a better job. Why Dumbledore hadn't fired him was a mystery to everyone. If defense against the dark arts was becoming dull, potions class was downright painful for Kyle. Snape's attitude had soured even further since the Ravenclaw-Slytherin match, almost as if he were taking out his frustrations on Kyle. His point deductions were severe, often starting at 5 points with no apparent limit. Though some of these points were restored later, usually due to Conna's intervention, Kyle found himself repeatedly tempted to grab Michael's cauldron and drop it on Snape's head. He refrained, however, since his own potions were precise and wouldn't have much impact on Snape even if dumped on him. Michael's, on the other hand, was another story. His potions were like Schrodinger's concoctions, their effects unpredictable until fully brewed, and hard to remedy. Harry was also feeling the sting of Snape's criticism, though his point deductions were not as severe as Kyle's. In fact, after hearing about Kyle's ordeals, Harry's own grievances with Snape seemed trivial, and his spirits lifted considerably. Now, even if he ran into Snape outside of potions class, he could keep his composure. Fred and George were right, Harry remarked with a smile while playing a game of wizard chess. It seems like Snape really does dislike Kyle more. If that's the case, maybe we actually have a shot at winning the House Cup. Ron added eagerly. If Snape keeps bothering the Hufflepuffs, it'll be perfect for Gryffindor, he went on, his excitement evident. Ron, don't jinx it, Harry replied, guiding his knight to take a pawn. We'll win fair and square, even if Snape isn't the one refereeing our match. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 207, Overwhelming Support Rate. As the second week approached, anticipation for the match continued to build, and the atmosphere in Hufflepuff became tense. The stakes were high. This game would determine who would claim crucial points and gain a solid lead heading into the final. It was the weekend, but the Hufflepuff common room was unusually quiet. No one even attempted to do their homework. Harris, the team captain, was visibly jittery, pacing the common room with a toy broomstick in hand and repeatedly going over game day reminders. Meanwhile, the two Hufflepuff beaters practiced their swings with intense focus. They knew that the Gryffindor beaters, Fred and George Weasley, were the best at Hogwarts, and they were determined not to let their team down. Kyle worried they might exhaust themselves and end up in the hospital wing from overworking their arms. Thankfully, Professor Sprout had brought in a pot of mood-enhancing herbs to lighten the tension. Since Hufflepuff's victory the previous year, Professor Sprout had taken a keen interest in Quidditch, and these times were a rare type, known for their uplifting effect. Resembling the three-headed dog in rarity, the flowers and leaves also served as key ingredients for the luck-enhancing potion Felix Felicis. Kyle felt a pang of envy at this unique plant, but there was no time to think about it now. By the time they reached the Great Hall at noon, they were the center of attention. Surprisingly, almost everyone, aside from the Gryffindors, seemed to be rooting for Hufflepuff. The Slytherins, of course, were thrilled at any chance to see Gryffindor lose. The Ravenclaw's motivations were more complex. Though they had been shut out in their last match, if Gryffindor performed poorly, it would soften the blow to Ravenclaw's pride. It was like an exam where only one person scores perfectly. As long as everyone else fails, individual scores don't sting as much. There's little difference between a failing score and a 0 when everyone's struggling. For Gryffindor, it was jarring to face such overwhelmingly lopsided support from the school. Usually, only Slytherin experienced this kind of reception. During dinner, Wood, the Gryffindor captain, was furious, nearly tearing his plate apart in frustration. "Forget what they say, we're the best," Wood exclaimed. Surveying his teammates, who seemed just as dispirited, he pushed his plate aside and raised his voice. "Support doesn't decide anything. We're going to win this game and show everyone who the strongest team at Hogwarts really is. You're right. Chaser Angelina echoed, pushing her plate away and raising her glass of pumpkin juice high. Let's show them who's strongest. As she finished, Fred and George raised their glasses as well, adding with a grin, hey, don't forget, we're Gryffindor. Yeah, exactly, Harry chimed in. We can absolutely win this. Gradually, everyone around the table lifted their glasses, and a wave of renewed energy washed over them. They laughed, and the previous somber mood evaporated. Harry, in the midst of his friends, raised his glass high, his face flushed with excitement. After lunch, the match was ready to begin. As students arrived one by one at the Quidditch pitch, the stands grew increasingly lively. In the team's changing rooms, Harris was delivering his usual pep talk. Captain, you've said this like 800 times already. How about we just stay quiet for a bit? Keeper Quirrell muttered, peering out the door and taking a deep breath. The stands are packed with people supporting us. I'm more nervous than I was during last year's final. What if we don't do well? Wait, who is that? Oh my goodness, Dumbledore is here too. Dumbledore? The room went silent as everyone crowded around the door to take a look. That's fantastic. Harris exclaimed, waving his arm excitedly when he spotted the silver-white beard. If Dumbledore's here to watch, Snape definitely won't dare mess with Kyle. The biggest worry that had been nagging at him suddenly felt resolved. Harris was completely at ease now. Soon, the door to the changing rooms opened, and the team marched out onto the pitch. Look, the Hufflepuff team is coming in. Lee Jordan's voice echoed from the stands. They're the favorites, just as strong as Gryffindor. They beat Ravenclaw and Slytherin in the last match and didn't even let them score a single point. Lee Jordan was clearly stirring the pot, taunting both teams to rally behind Hufflepuff. But his words were quickly drowned out by a wave of boos, and snack wrappers, flavored beans, and even a few shoes rained down on him. Jordan. Professor McGonagall's voice called sharply as she waved her wand, giving him a stern look. Oh, sorry, Professor McGonagall, I was just stating the facts. The booing around him intensified. Even Snape, acting as referee, shot Lee Jordan a hard glare, wondering if he should give the boy a taste of what Kyle got last time in potions class. Lee Jordan felt a chill run down his spine, as though something dreadful had taken notice of him. Realizing he'd roused the crowd's ire, he quickly abandoned any attempts at adding personal commentary and started giving the play-by-play properly. This commentary is really getting under people's skin. If we lose, it'll look bad, and we'll just end up as Gryffindor's stepping stone, Cedric muttered. It doesn't matter, as long as we win, Kyle replied with a smile. If we also keep Gryffindor at 0 points, he won't have much to say next time. Then I'd better catch the snitch quickly, Cedric laughed. The two team captains soon shook hands, and Madame Hooch's whistle signaled the start of the game. Kyle, with the advantage of his broomstick, was the first to seize the quaffle. Harris followed close behind, perfectly in sync, as they streaked toward Gryffindor's goalpost. Angelina and Alicia Spinnet rushed to intercept, but their broomsticks couldn't match the speed of the Nimbus 2000, and they were forced to trail far behind. Fred sent a bludger their way, but Kyle smoothly dodged it with a flick of his wrist. Reaching the scoring area, Kyle feinted a pass to Harris on his left, then sent a backhanded shot toward the right goalpost. The cheering in the stands fell silent, and everyone watched the quaffle with bated breath. Only Lee Jordan kept up his commentary at a breakneck pace. Kyle pitches, another feint. Wood can, beautiful, Wood sees right through his move. The ball is intercepted, and now Gryffindor takes the initiative. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 208, Snape's solo performance as the only keeper captain among the 4 teams. Wood's skill was indisputable. Kyle hadn't really expected to score right at the start, though. This opening shot was just to get a feel for the game. Now he knew, this match was going to be a tough one. We're in trouble, he muttered, his face serious, a flicker of regret passing over him. Shutting Gryffindor out with 0 points wasn't going to be easy. If he'd known, he wouldn't have bragged to Cedric just now. On the other side of the pitch, Wood threw him a smug wink before launching the quaffle to a teammate downfield. And Gryffindor's got the quaffle now. It's chaser Alicia Spinnet. A talent discovered by Oliver Wood's sharp eye. Last year, she was only a reserve. Lee Jordan's commentary rang out, his voice noticeably louder and more animated than before. The ball is passed to Katie Bell. Oh, but Hufflepuff snatches it back. It's Kyle again, moving like he's born to fly. Goodness, he's incredible at dodging that bludger without slowing down. Why isn't he a seeker? Sorry, Diggory, I didn't mean anything by it. Cedric glanced at the commentary box, mildly annoyed, but he had to admit Lee Jordan was right. Kyle was fantastic in the air. As for why Kyle wasn't playing seeker, Cedric had once asked him the same thing, even offering to compete for the position fairly if he wanted it. But Kyle had just laughed and turned him down without a second thought, saying, "I love the game of Quidditch, not some silly game of hide-and-seek with a golden snitch." It was an important position, though. Cedric just shook his head with a sigh and returned his focus to spotting the golden snitch in the sky. Meanwhile, Kyle's in front of the goalposts again. This could be it. He goes for the shot. No, he fakes. The quaffles with Harris now. Wood's been tricked. And it's a score for Hufflepuff. Wow. Was that really a Porskoff ploy? Jordan. Professor McGonagall's voice cut sharply through the stands. Sorry, Professor McGonagall, won't happen again. With Harris's goal, the scoreboard flashed 10 o'clock. But just as the crowd was about to break into cheers, a sharp whistle pierced the air. Snape had ruled that Kyle's maneuver to dodge the bludger was a foul, and he disallowed the goal, resetting the score to 0-0. This isn't fair. Harris shouted in frustration. We already scored, why didn't you say anything then? Snape ignored him entirely, his expression indifferent. It's no use, save your energy, Kyle murmured, familiar with Snape's underhanded ways. At least he didn't give Gryffindor a penalty, so we're still in the game. I'm going to see Professor Sprout and Madam Hooch. Harris fumed, waving his arm angrily. If he's the referee for the next match, we'll refuse to play. In the stands, the crowd roared their displeasure, voices rising in protest. But it was pointless. Snape remained unmoved, as if he couldn't hear a word they were saying. In the Gryffindor stands, Ron, struggling to keep his emotions in check, whispered to Hermione, "Looks like Harry was right. Snape really is targeting Kyle." "But that's not fair," Hermione frowned. "I've read Quidditch through the ages, Kyle hasn't broken any rules at all." Yes, I know," Ron mumbled. "But that's actually bad for us." Ouch. Someone jabbed Ron in the back of the head. It was Malfoy. "Oh, sorry, Weasley, didn't see you there," Malfoy sneered, grinning at Crabbe and Goyle. "You should be thanking Professor Snape. He probably just doesn't want you lot to lose too badly." Ron opened his mouth to argue, but words failed him as Snape awarded yet another baseless penalty against Kyle. 2. Malfoy's grin faded, his tone tinged with envy. "What makes Professor Snape take such good care of your side, just because you're all brainless? Maybe you should join the team, Neville Longbottom," he mocked. "With an empty head like yours, maybe Professor Snape would just give you the golden snitch." Neville's face turned red as he twisted in his seat to face Malfoy. "Shut up, Malfoy, I'm not scared of you this time," he stammered. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle burst into loud laughter. "Didn't learn your lesson last time, did you? Want to feel the leglocker curse again? I bet it'd be loads of fun hopping all the way back to the castle from here." Neville's face flushed even redder, his fists clenched, but Malfoy kept taunting him. Finally, Neville snapped. He swung over the back of his seat, and before Malfoy knew what was happening, he was on the ground. Ron saw the scuffle unfold and rushed over to help. Within moments, he, Neville, Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle were rolling in a tangled brawl beneath the stands, fighting as fiercely as the players on the pitch. But all around them, the crowd's attention stayed fixed on the game, Hermione's included. Her gaze was locked on the action below. Suddenly, Harry, with no warning, dove toward the ground, his eyes locked on what looked like the golden snitch. But just at that moment, Snape called yet another foul on Kyle, enraging a Hufflepuff beater, who swung his bat in frustration. The bludger, speeding dangerously, grazed Harry's nose before zooming straight at Snape, making him flinch back in surprise. By the time Harry recovered, the snitch had vanished. Oh, for Merlin's sake! Why now of all times? Harry muttered in frustration, pulling his broom back up and returning to the air. From that point on, the match felt like a showcase of Snape's power, his magical whistle stripping Hufflepuff of at least 50 points with repeated calls. Then, at the 30-minute mark, just as both Harry and Cedric charged at the snitch, Snape inexplicably positioned himself right in front of Harry's path. Forced to veer away to avoid a collision, Harry lost his best chance to catch it. In the end, Cedric caught the snitch, mere inches ahead of Harry. The match was over, with a final score of 180-20. Hufflepuff had won. As Harry angrily dismounted, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Looking up, he found Dumbledore smiling down at him. "You did very well," Dumbledore murmured, his voice gentle, meant only for Harry. "I'm sorry about the outcome, but I'm glad to see you're not spending all your time looking in the mirror, living life to the fullest. Brilliant." Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 209, A Good Place to Relax. This was probably the most extraordinary Quidditch match Hogwarts had seen in a century. Hufflepuff, who had been unfairly targeted throughout the entire match, won the game, yet none of them felt any joy. They celebrated briefly and symbolically before hurrying back to the changing rooms. Gryffindor, who hadn't been the target of Snape's ire, lost once again, and naturally, they weren't pleased either. Even many of the spectators found their enthusiasm dampened by the incessant fouls and sat down in the hope the game would end soon. If anyone was satisfied with the match, it was Snape, the referee. With his enchanted whistle, he'd managed to turn the game into a personal show, focusing on Kyle and preventing Harry from seizing the golden snitch. "I never knew being a Quidditch referee could be so entertaining. I might try it again sometime," Snape thought, feeling thoroughly satisfied as he dismounted his broom, especially when he saw the pale faces of Kyle and Harry. He couldn't remember feeling this pleased, not even the first time he brewed Felix Felicis. He really ought to die. In the Hufflepuff changing rooms, Harris was pounding the wall in fury. A 30-minute match, and Professor Snape, he actually called 21 fouls on us. I've never seen anything so outrageous. Even at the Quidditch World Cup in 1473, the average was only one foul every 2 minutes. If Snape is refereeing the next match, we refuse to participate. Everyone nodded in agreement. They had no desire to endure another match as miserable as today's. This was especially true for Kyle, who had been the target of all 21 fouls. Staying in the game to the end was an achievement in itself. Instead of staying with his teammates, Kyle left the changing rooms alone, hoping to find somewhere to clear his mind. The Forbidden Forest seemed like a good option, except that Hagrid had been keeping a close watch lately. Kyle was spotted the moment he arrived and was taken straight back to Hagrid's hut. "I watched the match, it wasn't your fault," Hagrid said, pouring Kyle a cup of tea to comfort him. "Professor Snape doesn't seem to know Quidditch very well, and everyone could see you didn't commit any fouls." "I've heard that a few times already, Hagrid," Kyle replied, taking a sip of tea. "Are you really not going to let me go to the Forbidden Forest?" "No, Kyle," Hagrid replied sternly. "The Forbidden Forest is too dangerous right now. If it had been anyone else, I'd have sent them straight back to the castle and reported them to a professor, costing them quite a few points." Seeing Hagrid's resolve, Kyle decided not to press further. In truth, if he'd really wanted to go to the Forbidden Forest, he could have used the Cloak of Invisibility or the Disillusionment Charm, and Hagrid would never have noticed. But there was no need for that. There were plenty of other places he could go for a walk, the Forbidden Forest wasn't the only option. After leaving Hagrid's hut, Kyle ran into Harry by the Black Lake. "Potter, are you here to see Hagrid too?" "No, well, yes," Harry replied, looking a little uneasy. "I just don't want to keep listening to people trying to comfort me." "Understandable." Kyle patted him on the shoulder. "Go on, then, Hagrid was just talking about you." With that, Kyle turned to leave. But before he'd taken 2 steps, Harry suddenly called out, "Wait. What's up?" "Kyle, did you see anyone strange just now?" "Strange? How do you mean?" "Well, someone in a hood or something." Kyle thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Sorry, I didn't notice anything like that. But you could ask Hagrid. If anyone strange was headed for the Forbidden Forest, he might have seen them." "Okay, thanks." "You're welcome." After saying goodbye to Harry, Kyle turned and made his way back to the castle. Now Kyle finally understood what Harry had meant. Almost everyone, whether they knew him or not, would approach him with a few words of sympathy whenever they spotted him. And more people were coming his way. Kyle quickened his pace and headed to the library for a bit of peace. Madame Pants helped him clear out anyone who wasn't there to read, giving him a temporary sanctuary. Hiding behind the bookshelves, he cast the disillusionment charm on himself, slipped out, and made his way up the revolving staircase to the room of requirement on the 8th floor. After half a school year of diligent effort, he had gradually moved the mature plants from his flower garden into his enchanted suitcase. However, those that were still growing remained here for the time being. The room of requirement offered a more suitable environment for magical plants to thrive. After all, creating rain or adjusting the weather within a suitcase wasn't exactly feasible, at least, not with his current abilities. The same went for his mooncalves. They would need to stay here for a while longer, until he'd fully finished modifying the suitcase for them. Because he had planted so many plants at the beginning of the school year, even though he'd moved a batch already, the garden didn't look empty in the slightest. In fact, it was quite crowded. Seeing the plants flourishing in their beds immediately lifted Kyle's spirits. "I can see why Professor Sprout and Newt Scamander found this so rewarding," he thought. Whether with plants or magical creatures, watching them grow bit by bit really was deeply fulfilling. Kyle made his way through a row of large pots of chomping cabbage and reached the back of the room, where a patch of land was dedicated to the venomous tentacula. This vine-like plant shared some traits with Devil's Snare, as both had a tendency to wrap around any nearby living things. However, the venomous tentacula was far more dangerous. Unlike Devil's Snare, it thrived in sunlight and was highly toxic. A prick from its barbs or a bite could be deadly. This was the primary reason it was classified as a Class C non-tradable material by the Ministry of Magic. Nevertheless, the venomous tentacula grew relatively slowly. Even with a daily dose of mooncalf manure as fertilizer, it had only managed to sprout a thin shoot, and its characteristic spikes were still just a few tiny, black dots. The fanged geranium on the other side was at a similar stage. The chomping cabbage, however, was thriving, with a short growth cycle and convenience to boot. Despite being planted on the same day, these had already sprouted sharp teeth. Ever since Kyle had arrived at the flower bed, he could hear their teeth clattering, creating a brisk, fast-paced rhythm. Returning to the chomping cabbage, Kyle took out his suitcase from the moleskin pouch, picked some of the healthiest and most vigorous ones, and carefully placed them inside. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 210, What About Your Egg? After March, the weather gradually warmed up, and the ice that had blanketed the Black Lake all winter finally thawed last week. Lately, the giant squid had taken to occasionally poking its head and tentacles out of the lake's depths to bask in the warm sunlight on the surface. This sight had drawn a crowd of fascinated students. Although many who'd read Hogwarts, a history knew about the giant squid in Black Lake, sightings were rare. With the exception of Slytherins, whose common room was located under the lake, most students didn't often get a glimpse of it themselves. Now, everyone was eager to see, especially the new students who rushed down to the lake as soon as classes ended. Suddenly, the Black Lake had become Hogwarts' latest hotspot, like an Instagram-worthy attraction. Kyle, however, didn't join the crowd. He'd already seen the squid once at the end of last year. To be honest, it was just like any other squid, just much larger. And staring at it too long only made him hungry. Since grilling it wasn't an option, he figured there was no point in watching it again. He might as well spend that time reading a couple more books. After months of study, he'd nearly mastered the undetectable extension charm. While he still wasn't proficient enough to enlarge spaces as much as he'd like, he had finally overcome the hardest part, the first successful transformation. Kyle planned to finish transforming his suitcase before his 5th year. He wasn't expecting it to be quite as expansive as Newt's, but he at least wanted it to hold half of the Forbidden Forest. Over the past 2 years, Kyle had accumulated quite a few things. The plants in his flower bed alone could fill the suitcase as it was, not to mention the designated areas for the troll and the mooncalf. And there would be new residents joining in the future. So he got to work. Afterward, Kyle spent every spare moment he could inside his suitcase. Thanks to his efforts, he completed the first major expansion by the 3rd day of the Easter holiday. The internal space was now nearly twice as large as it had been. Surveying his handiwork, Kyle nodded in satisfaction. The upgrade felt like moving from a cramped apartment to a villa. All his earlier space issues had been resolved at once. The troll now had a much larger area to roam, and Kyle could start preparing a new home for the mooncalves. Creating a suitable cave for it would require ample space, but now that he had the room, he could finally begin. The only downside was that the expanded area looked a bit monotonous now, as it was wide open and lacked much detail. But that could be easily fixed. The next morning, Kyle headed into the Forbidden Forest. He wanted to use the holiday break to find 2 rowan trees to transplant into his suitcase. Naturally, he couldn't do this in broad daylight, since Hagrid would surely notice, so this trip was just for scouting. He needed to pick his targets so he could come back under cover of night. A few minutes later, Kyle arrived at Hagrid's hut. Oddly, the door was closed, and all the curtains were tightly drawn. Even the small window at the top was covered with an old copy of the Daily Prophet. Kyle knocked on the door. "Who is it?" came Hagrid's voice from inside, sounding a bit nervous. The door opened just a crack. "Phew, it's you, Kyle. What brings you here?" "I need your help with something," Kyle replied. "May I come in?" "Of course," Hagrid said, stepping aside to let Kyle in, then quickly closing the door behind him. The hut was stiflingly warm, almost like a sauna. Despite the sunny weather, a roaring fire blazed in the fireplace. And there, sitting with Hagrid, were 3 familiar faces, Harry, Ron, and Hermione. "Hello," Kyle greeted them. "Hello. Long time no see. Kyle." "Good morning." The 3 stood in front of the fireplace, a bit tense, shifting nervously as they replied. They were like a wall between Kyle and the fireplace, their eyes darting around as they spoke. It was clear to anyone that something unusual was happening with the fireplace. Fortunately, Hagrid came over just then, carrying a teacup, a brass pot, and a sandwich filled with ferret meat for Kyle. "You said you needed my help?" "Yes," Kyle replied, tearing his gaze from the fireplace. "I wanted to go to the Forbidden Forest to collect some rowan branches. Is that all right?" "Still making those amulets?" Hagrid asked, grinning. Kyle's exam-passing amulet from last year had been a hit at Hogwarts, and Hagrid had definitely heard about it. Kyle nodded. "The final exams are in 2 months, so we need to prepare early." "That's easy," Hagrid said with a chuckle. "I can bring you as many as you need tomorrow. No need to go to all that trouble. I can pick them myself." "But..." Hagrid hesitated, clearly uneasy with the idea of Kyle going into the Forbidden Forest. "Don't worry, Hagrid," Kyle reassured him. "The rowan trees are right at the edge of the forest. It's perfectly safe. Besides, I need to pick as many branches as I can in the right shapes, Otherwise, it'll be a lot of extra work to process them. Well, all right, then. Hagrid finally conceded, though he added, but you can only go as far as the edge of the Forbidden Forest. No problem, Kyle agreed readily, since that was his plan anyway. Hagrid stood up, preparing to go with him. Hagrid, are you coming with us? Kyle asked. Of course, I can't let you go to the Forbidden Forest alone, Hagrid replied. Even if it's just the edge. What about the dragon egg? Kyle asked. Are you sure you can leave it with Potter and the others? It'll be fine. The egg's not that fragile. Just make sure you don't let the fire. Wait. Hermione's surprised voice interrupted him. Kyle, how did you know there was a dragon egg here? You can't even see it from where you're standing. Hagrid froze, his eyes widening as he turned to Kyle. Yes, how did Kyle know there was a dragon egg? You don't think standing in front of the fireplace will hide it, do you? Kyle said with a grin. I'd suggest reading the latest edition of Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. It clearly states in the chapter on dragons that dragon eggs emit a faint sulfur smell when exposed to flames. It's subtle, and it can blend with the smell of the fire, so it's easy to miss. He paused, then added, if you don't believe me, you might want to check on Fawn. I think he's about to pass out. Kyle gestured to the side, where Hagrid's large black hound lay slumped in the corner, his head drooping. He looked nothing like his usual energetic self, seeming listless and worn out. Oh, Fawn! What's wrong with you? Hagrid cried, rushing over to pick up the heavy dog before dashing out of the hut with him in his arms. Now the fun in this clip is over. Which listeners haven't liked and commented yet? You can press like and comment to encourage the admin find the fun in the next clip. May the listeners be happy forever.